It is a Friday evening in the autumn of 1963, and a Korean War veteran from Detroit, Michigan, is pushing a shopping trolley through the aisles of his local Kmart. He has a bag of charcoal in the trolley, a tin of house paint, a child's bicycle tyre. He is doing the kind of errand that consumes Friday evenings in the lives of ordinary working men, the accumulated small necessities of a household that requires constant maintenance. He turns into the sporting goods section. He stops. Behind the glass counter, lying flat on a green baize display surface with a white price card propped beside it, is a rifle. Not just any rifle. It is 110 centimetres of blued steel, an American walnut that he last held in his hands on a frozen Korean ridgeline in the winter of 1950, when the temperature was minus 28 degrees Celsius, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army was coming down the hill in numbers that no intelligence estimate had predicted. He knows the weight of it without picking it up. He knows the sound it makes. He knows the particular metallic ping of the bloc clip ejecting when the last round is fired. A sound that, in the silence of a Korean night, told him he had 8 seconds to reload before the next wave arrived. The price card reads $7.95. He stands there for a long time. The charcoal and the paint and the bicycle tyre sit in his trolley. He does not move. What this man is looking at is the M1 Garand rifle, the weapon that General George S. Patton described, in a letter written in January 1945, as the greatest battle implement ever devised by man. 4 million of them ended up in Kmart stores across America. This is why, and this is what the law of 1968 did to stop it. The M1 Garand's path to the Kmart counter began not in a shop, but in a crisis, specifically the crisis of American infantry firepower in the years between the two world wars, a crisis so protracted and so bitterly contested within the Army's ordnance establishment that it consumed nearly 2 decades before arriving at its solution. The First World War had demonstrated, with a thoroughness that cost millions of lives, that the bolt-action rifle was inadequate for the kind of warfare that modern industrial nations could produce. The problem was not accuracy. The Springfield M1903 was an accurate rifle. The problem was the rate of fire, the bolt-action mechanism requiring a manual cycling motion between each shot that imposed an absolute ceiling of approximately 15 aimed rounds per minute on any individual soldier, regardless of training or experience, against prepared machine gun positions, against massed infantry assault, against the fluid close-quarters fighting that characterized the decisive moments of modern battle. 15 rounds per minute was not enough. It was frequently, in the bluntest possible terms, a death sentence. The United States Army's Ordnance Department recognized this problem clearly and set about solving it in 1919. The same year the war that had demonstrated it so bloodily finally ended. The search for a semi-automatic replacement for the Springfield consumed the next 17 years. Designer after designer submitted proposals. Weapons by Peterson, by Thompson, by Browning, and by a Canadian-born engineer named John Cantius Garand, who had joined Springfield Armory in Massachusetts in 1919 and would remain there, patiently refining his designs for the entire duration of the search. The problem was not merely technical, it was also political and financial. The Army's budgets in the 1920s and early 1930s were constrained to the point of absurdity by a Congress that regarded military expenditure as wasteful in peacetime, and a public that regarded another European war as someone else's problem. Trials that should have taken months stretched to years. Specifications that were nearly met were revised. Designs that satisfied one requirement were found lacking in another. The process that should have produced a result by 1925 was still producing competing prototypes in 1935. Meanwhile, America's potential adversaries were not standing still. Germany's Wehrmacht was developing the doctrine of combined arms warfare that would devastate Poland in 1939. Japan's Kwantung Army was demonstrating in Manchuria the kind of aggressive mechanized operations that would eventually reach Pearl Harbor. The window of time available to re-equip an entire army with a new standard infantry rifle was narrowing with every year that the ordnance trials continued. The existing alternatives were each inadequate in specific and documented ways. Peterson's delayed blowback design was technically elegant, but required a proprietary cartridge that would have complicated the Army's ammunition supply. Various Garand prototypes had progressed through gas trap to gas port operation and shown continuous improvement, but had not yet passed the Army's demanding endurance tests. The pressure on Springfield Armory to produce a final answer was, by 1934, becoming acute. John Garand had been working on his gas-operated semi-automatic design since 1920, refining it through iteration after iteration, with the patience of a man who understood that getting it right mattered more than getting it done quickly. The operating principle he had settled on by the early 1930s was elegant in its mechanical logic. When a cartridge was fired, propellant gas was tapped through a port, drilled in the barrel, and directed rearward against a piston, which drove an operating rod that rotated and unlocked the bolt, extracted and ejected the spent case, cocked the hammer, and chambered the next round from the 8-shot and block clip, all in the fraction of a second between the bullet leaving the barrel and the firer's eye returning to the sight picture. The N block clip, a stamped steel carrier holding 8 rounds of .30-06 Springfield ammunition that fed directly into the fixed internal magazine and was automatically ejected with a distinctive metallic ring when the last round was fired, was both the M1's most recognisable feature and the source of its most persistent tactical criticism. 8 rounds was, critics argued throughout the weapon's service life, insufficient compared to the 10-round magazines of the Lee Enfield or the higher capacities of some competing designs. Garand and the Army's proponents argued that the N-block system's speed of reloading, the entire clip inserted with a single downward press of the thumb, more than compensated for the reduced capacity. The argument was never definitively resolved, though the M1's combat record across 3 wars suggests that 8 rounds was rarely the decisive limiting factor in any engagement. The weapon was formally adopted on January 9, 1936, 17 years after Garand had joined Springfield Armory and begun his work. It measured 110 centimetres from muzzle to butt plate and weighed 4.37 kilograms unloaded. Manageable for a soldier of average build, though heavier than the carbines and submachine guns that supplemented it in American service. Springfield Armory began production at the modest initial rate of 10 rifles per day in 1937, a figure that seems almost comically inadequate against the production demands that were coming. Winchester Repeating Arms in New Haven, Connecticut, joined production in 1940 under a government contract that expanded manufacturing capacity significantly. International Harvester in Evansville, Indiana, and Harrington and Richardson Arms in Worcester, Massachusetts, added their capacity in the wartime years. At peak production in 1943 and 1944, combined output across all manufacturers reached approximately 4,000 rifles every working day. Total American wartime production reached approximately 5.4 million. M1 Garands by 1945, with continued production through the Korean War years adding to that figure. The 4 million referenced in accounts of the Kmart surplus trade reflects a portion of the total production distributed through civilian channels. A figure whose precise documentation across all surplus disposal mechanisms is difficult to establish with certainty from surviving records. In the hands of American soldiers across every theatre of the Second World War, the M1 Garand did precisely what its 17-year development had promised. The semi-automatic capability that set it apart from every other standard infantry rifle of the conflict proved decisive, not in the dramatic set-piece engagements of military history, but in the countless small firefights and close-quarters actions that collectively determined who lived and who died. At Guadalcanal in August 1942, Marines armed with M1 Garands engaged Japanese infantry in the jungle fighting that characterized the first American offensive ground operation of the Pacific War. Japanese commanders, accustomed to the fire rates of bolt-action rifles from their own experience, found themselves facing volume of fire that their intelligence had not predicted and their tactics had not prepared for. Veterans of Guadalcanal described enemy soldiers who had positioned themselves to exploit the reload pause of a bolt-action rifle, finding that no such pause existed. The M1 continuing to fire as fast as the shooter could pull the trigger until the N block clip ejected with its distinctive ring. In the frozen nightmare of the Chosin Reservoir in November and December 1950, surrounded by Chinese divisions whose encirclement had been entirely unforeseen, Marines and soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division maintained the M1 Garand's function in temperatures that defeated almost every other mechanical device they carried. The gas-operated mechanism, properly maintained and adequately lubricated with cold weather oil, continued to cycle reliably in conditions that froze the actions of lesser weapons. Veterans of the chosen breakout, interviewed decades later, cited the M1's reliability in extreme cold as a factor in their survival that they ranked alongside the performance of the Marine Corps air support and the stamina of the men themselves. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The comparative record of the M1 Garand against its contemporaries reveals not merely a superior weapon, but a superior doctrine: the American decision to distribute semi-automatic capability to every rifleman, rather than concentrating automatic fire in crew-served weapons, represented a fundamental philosophical difference from every other major combatant nation of the Second World War. Germany's Karabiner 98K was, by the consensus of every serious assessment, a superbly manufactured bolt-action rifle. Its Mauser action was mechanically refined to a degree that German manufacturing quality made possible, and its accuracy at range exceeded the M1 Garand's in careful testing. But it remained a bolt-action design, imposing on every German rifleman the 15 rounds per minute ceiling that American ordnance planners had identified as inadequate in 1919. German tactical doctrine compensated through the universal deployment of MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns at squad level, creating a fire superiority through specialised crew-served weapons rather than through individual rifle capability. The practical result was that a German rifle squad's automatic fire capability was concentrated in a single weapon requiring a dedicated two-man crew, whilst an American rifle squad distributed comparable fire rates across every individual member. In the fluid, decentralised close-quarters fighting that characterised so much of the decisive combat of the Second World War, hedgerow clearance in Normandy, island fighting in the Pacific, urban warfare in Germany, the American approach proved consistently more flexible and more resilient to the loss of individual soldiers. The Soviet Mosin-Nagant, a 5-round bolt-action design that had entered service in 1891, remained the standard Soviet infantry rifle throughout the entire war. Over 17 million were produced between 1930 and 1945. A figure that dwarfs American Garand production, but reflects a fundamentally different approach, compensating for individual weapon limitations through sheer mass of men and material. The contrast with American doctrine could not have been more complete. The German Gewehr 43 semi-automatic rifle, produced in approximately 402,000 examples between 1943 and 1945, demonstrated that German ordnance engineers understood the tactical advantage of semi-automatic fire, but arrived too late in too small numbers to alter the fundamental imbalance that the M1 Garand had established in American favour from the opening battles of the Pacific War. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 gave the M1 Garand its second major conflict, and confirmed every conclusion the Second World War had established. By the late 1950s, with the M14 rifle entering development, and the Army transitioning to 7.62mm NATO standardisation, the Garand began its migration from frontline service weapon to surplus commodity. The timing coincided with the extraordinary expansion of American discount retail. Kmart, founded by Harry Blair Cunningham in Garden City, Michigan, with its first store opening on March 1, 1962, was by 1963 already operating dozens of stores across the American Midwest, and expanding at a rate that would eventually make it one of the dominant retail forces in the country. Its sporting goods section, stocked with the practical equipment that working American families required, became natural outlets for the surplus military rifles that the government needed to dispose of and the civilian market apparently wanted to buy. The $7.95 price point for an M1 Garand at Kmart was the honest arithmetic of surplus disposal, a weapon whose manufacture had cost the government tens of times that figure, offered through the most efficient commercial channel available at a price that cleared inventory without requiring explanation or justification. Veterans bought them with the particular satisfaction of men reacquiring something they had carried through the worst experiences of their lives. Collectors bought them as artifacts of historical weight. Hunters bought them as practical sporting rifles. The transactions were unremarkable. They were simply commerce. Then October 22, 1968 arrived, and President Lyndon Johnson signed the Gun Control Act into law, and the Kmart sporting goods counter lost its most historically significant product permanently. The Act's provisions, ending mail order sales, imposing comprehensive dealer licensing requirements, restricting surplus military imports, dismantled the infrastructure of the surplus trade without touching the weapons already in private hands. The M1 Garands already sold from Kmart counters, and Sears catalogues and Walmart sporting goods sections remained exactly where they were, legally owned, legally kept. The pipeline simply closed. The civilian marksmanship program continues today, distributing M1 Garands to eligible civilians at prices between $650 and $1,050. On the open collector market, original matching examples in excellent condition command between $1,500 and $3,000. The $7.95 Kmart Garand has become, through the passage of 60 years and the operation of federal law, one of the most valuable casual purchases in American retail history. Return to that Friday evening in Detroit. Return to the Korean War veteran standing before the Kmart counter with his charcoal and his paint and his bicycle tyre. He is looking at the rifle he carried on a frozen ridgeline. He is hearing, in the silence of a discount store sporting goods section, the metallic ping of an empty en-bloc clip in the Korean dark. He buys it. Of course he buys it. $7.95 for the rifle that kept him alive. 4 million M1 Garands came through those glass counters. They had already crossed oceans and won a world and held a peninsula. They had already done everything that John Garand spent 17 years designing them to do. At $7.95, they were the greatest bargain in the history of American retail. At any price, they were the greatest battle rifle America ever built. General Patton was right. He usually was.